Okay, part two. What is unacceptable? So, again, this is from Ofcom from 4 years ago. Viewers and listeners are now less tolerant of racist or discriminatory words. Watershed remains vital for protecting audiences from offensive material, and people say they are more likely to tolerate swearing if it reflects the real world. So that last point is absolutely the point that I was making earlier in the last video about how soap operas don't necessarily truly reflect the real world, whereas crime programs, sort of things like Line of Duty and, all of those crime thrillers that are very popular, those police procedural programs, people do tolerate swearing and offensive language simply because it reflects reality and reflects the real world of when people are put under a great deal of stress. So that notion of watershed remaining vital, even though it's pretty much pointless these days because of television on demand, we have retained at least this notion of categorization. And if people want to watch live television, the watershed is in place. And if, as is more likely to be the case nowadays, if people watch things on demand, then they do at least have that pop-up, and which reminds them that this, you need to be over the age of 16 to watch it. And I suppose the some of that's reflected in the demographics of who are more likely to watch things on demand and on devices compared to those people that are more likely to watch live television on a television. And a lot of that, not exclusively, but a lot of that will be tied to perhaps age. So older viewers who have not grown up with computers and are perhaps not as familiar with watching things on demand or smart TVs are more likely to watch things live, and then the watershed is at least there. Especially as people tend, not always, but people tend to become more conservative with a small c, so not the Conservative Party, but conservative in as much as not wishing to push the boundaries of what's offensive or not. So people tend to become more conservative as they get older. But that's of course not that's not everybody. And as it says there, viewers and listeners are now less tolerant of racist or discriminatory words. So the what people in the UK certainly find offensive and inoffensive has changed. We are less likely to find swearing offensive. I mean, it used to be the case that, and sometimes you will still get people who'll do this, who will apologise for swearing in front of women. That is less likely to be the case now, and instead people are more likely to find it offensive if racist, as it says, or discriminatory words are used, and that is deemed as being far more offensive than saying the word shit in front of your granny, for example. So we need to sort of be aware here of a bit of sort of stuff that you may have come across in sort of things like sociolinguistics. But we need to be aware that language is changing constantly, and the media is aiding some of that speeding up and that rapid change. So we do need to be aware that what's deemed as unacceptable now really does focus upon notions, as it says there, of incivility, incongruity. Now, we've already looked at incongruity, but we looked at it a couple of weeks back, where the incongruity of the style and register compared to the setting, so the actual language spoken compared to the setting, there was an incongruity. And we looked at it very much through the lens of humour. But of course, if we have somebody who we expect to behave in certain ways, if we hear them using language that we wouldn't expect from them, we may be offended. So those of you that perhaps have been watching the new rebooted Spitting Image comedy show on BritBox may have seen that recently the Queen and the royal family have been depicted on there, and the Queen in particular, her character is extremely incongruous with what we expect of the Queen, because on Spitting Image she is now behaving like a mafia boss, a gangland boss, and she's using a great deal of offensive language. And that, of course, with that notion of incongruity, as we've already seen this term, there is humour arising from that. But there's a warning at the beginning of BritBox's Spitting Image that says that viewers may find this offensive. And there is a great deal, and always has been, particularly for that TV show, and you can see previous episodes, when it used to be on back in the 1980s, you can see clips of that on YouTube, and there is a great deal that people found very offensive because it dealt with racism and sexism, and the language that was used was not always what we might call politically correct, and that's the other word or the other phrase that we have there. So this notion of political correctness and forbidden discourse, coarseness and impoliteness. So we do need to actually consider what is acceptable and how things have changed. And if we're going to start considering those historical changes in style, we do need to also be aware that accents, dialects, speech registers have changed. We don't speak in the same way that our grandparents spoke, or in the same way that people did 100 years ago. Language changes, and you of course all know that. So the BBC and broadcasting in Britain has changed considerably over the last 50 years, over the last 100 years, certainly. Well, let's see, what are we, 2020? So yeah, it's not been going 100 years yet, but certainly over the last sort of 70 years. So, and broadcasting as a whole, well, yes, of course, there was radio in 1920. So, things have continued and do continue to change. So we have that traditional notion of broadcasting as a form of public address going out to the whole of Britain, and it has been very closely tied up with some sort of British national identity, and the BBC has traditionally spoken for the nation and to the nation. And if you had a look at some of the video clips from the week when we looked at Register and Form, Register and Style, you'll have seen that there were some film clips from the 1940s, that were from newsreels. But it always used to be the case that at the beginning of important film clips or television clips, or particularly radio, it would start with, this is the BBC. So that, and the BBC, remember, is not independent. It is not a commercial output. It is the British Broadcasting Company. It's owned by all of us. And, we pay for that through the licence fee. So as it says, up until the 1960s, the coverage of important state events tended to be, assumed importance to the audience. So things like royal weddings and royal funerals, but also things like the Queen's speech, those types of things, or any announcement from the government, all of those were assumed to be important to the audience. And that, to some extent, hasn't gone. We've seen this year with the frequent addresses to the nation from our Prime Minister, that it's been broadcast on the BBC, but we've then been able to access it on demand and online in various places, and it's automatically assumed that these are important to us. And of course, those a lot of those have been very important because they've sort of told us about the state of the pandemic and what tier we're in, or whether we should be inside, outside, or going anywhere or not, or going out to eat, or so on. We've been given sort of directives, and it's all been channeled through the BBC. So we can see from those three pictures there, and they are all famous British broadcasters of the sort of the mid 20th century, and yes, they are all old white men. And there were female reporters and female presenters, but they were the exception rather than the rule. And it's not really until the 1970s and 80s that we actually start to see some more diversity. And then we start by I'm not sure whether it was the 70s, late 70s possibly, but certainly into the 80s, that we have people like Sir Trevor McDonald, who of course is a black broadcaster, and it's not until then, as I say, particularly the 80s, that we start to see a diversity in race. And now, of course, it's the case that we are more likely to see a wider range of colours, genders, and so on. So people who reflect more correctly, or sort of more realistically, what we see in our everyday lives. That Britain isn't this homogenous white middle class nation. But that said, we are still hearing broadly Standard English, RP, the Queen's English. And there are some broadcasters who have a dialect, or have, an accent, but even those with accents tend to actually moderate them to make them far closer to RP. So yes, we may see women, we may see people of colour, but you could very easily switch off the screen, switch off the picture, and pretty much we're hearing the same type of voice, regardless of where that person's heritage is from. So yeah, and the last point there, it says about using voices with a slow tempo and a formal style. So very much, this gravitas. So what people were saying was of great importance. So they used this slow, formal style. And those interviews with politicians and public figures, when they appeared, they were very respectful, very deferential, and allowed people to sort of have their say. Well, of course, that has changed. But let's move on to looking at this notion of accent and dialect. So this notion of standard pronunciation, or RP, it very much proliferated around Britain once we actually have broadcast media. Once the radio arrives, then this notion of what a standard accent becomes far more pervasive across the UK. People start using that type of accent because they're hearing it on the radio. And but interestingly, we do start to have some regional accents beginning to appear on television, in the radio, but it's initially it was only in comedy and light entertainment. So this idea of, it was funny to have somebody talking with a sort of a working class London accent that we might call a Cockney accent, or for somebody to be speaking with a Welsh accent or a Scots accent, or other areas of England, or an Irish accent. But at first it was very much done for comedic reasons, and as it says, light entertainment. And you would be able to watch a television program where there were perhaps a variety of different accents, and then the news would come on and the person presenting the news would be using an RP accent. So very much a shift and a change of sort of formality, and all of that sort of formality and gravity being implied by that use of accent. So now what we're seeing these days is, as it says, a more heterogeneous culture, so a variety, and it's no longer looked upon as authority to be using just sort of what we might call a middle class or a posh received pronunciation accent. And in fact, some companies that have call centres actually make sure that their call centres are situated in places where that particular accent is regarded as being more reliable or friendlier or more trustworthy. So you'll find that some banks and insurance companies might have their call centres perhaps situated in the northeast, because a sort of a Tyne and Wear accent, a Geordie accent, is often regarded as being warmer and more trustworthy. Likewise, a mild Scottish accent, and I say mild, and I mean not a broad Glaswegian accent, but something perhaps from Edinburgh or from the Lowlands, which is, as I say, again regarded as being more trustworthy. Whereas there are other accents around Britain that are regarded as less trustworthy or less reliable, particularly accents from the Birmingham and Black Country are regarded as not having as much authority as other areas. So, but again, those of you that have done or are doing sociolinguistics with David Hornsby will know all about this stuff. So that's the BBC, which, as I say, we all pay for. But then there's commercial broadcasting, which has in recent years become even more widespread as we've come into the digital revolution, and there has been a deregulation of an awful lot of broadcasting. So commercial broadcasting, as it says, is more responsive to audience ratings. It has a closer relationship with audiences, so they can. It's possible to actually have a channel or TV programs that are absolutely focused on particular demographics, so that you can identify with them, and then you get this concept of pseudo intimacy. That this is we see this particularly with radio programs, that we are all of the listeners and we are part of a community, and particularly because radio has that possibility, that way of being extremely intimate, because it's one voice a lot of the time, and we carry it around with us, or we have it in our homes and so on, and it does end up becoming quite intimate. That can make us feel as though we are part of a community. And then of course there will be certain topics that are covered as part of that community, and all of the listeners then are quite often these days allowed to contribute, and that feeling, as I say, of an intimacy arises. So we also have commercial broadcasting giving us a mix of different formats, and this democratization, so that we have a mixing of high culture and popular culture. So it's it's not all about watching the ballet or listening to opera. And instead, even if you are listening to something like Classic FM, which may play opera, they will still have things like phone-ins and quizzes on there. So, those types of new ideas of TV formats, which also we have on the radio, that has come about with commercial broadcasting. And we have got that real democratization, which allows lots of people to be able to, have programs that are specifically for them. And the three, a quick reference to the three images along the top. On the left hand side, that's from the 1980s and 90s TV show on Channel 4 called The Tube, which was the programme to watch when you got home from school on a Friday. It used to come on at 6 p.m. And so we've got on the left there the person in pink that's very tall. That's the character of Dame Edna Everage, and then the person in the middle is Jools Holland, who's now known for doing the New Year's Eve programmes, and then the person on the right is Paula Yates, who sadly died, I think about 10 years ago, something like that. As I say, The Tube was extremely popular, but it was taken off the air after, in the opening scenes, it used to be broadcast live, and Jools Holland, I think it was right at the beginning of one episode, I think he used the word fuck. And shortly after that, the programme was just taken completely off the air, and sort of replaced with something else. And certainly, there is now a time delay in most live television programmes to try and stop bad language or, offensive language from being used. In the centre there, of course, is Ali G, who's Sacha Baron Cohen. And he has done a great deal to push the boundaries of what is acceptable and unacceptable on television and film. And if you've seen the recent Borat 2 movie, you'll know that he continues to push the boundaries of what is deemed acceptable. And then on the right hand side there, we have an online TV programme, which is from the comedian Russell, and I want to say Russell Grant, but he's an astrologer. And then I want to say Russell Crowe, but he's an actor. And I've forgotten his surname. Anyway, you know who I mean. But he's a comedian, and he's there with not David Miliband. Oh God, my brain has just completely gone. Ed Miliband, that's it. So this was before Ed Miliband. The picture was taken from before Ed Miliband was lost the general election some years ago. So we have this programme called The Trues, where Russell, I'm just going to call him by his first name because I really can't remember his surname. He interviews various people, and the title of it, The Trues, is very much a sort of a play on words, because he believes that he's sort of getting at the truth, and through being a comedian, he sort of interrogates that. And in fact, lots of his stand-up is very interesting because he does talk about critical reading and notions of truth and reality and so on. Okay, let's take another break there. Go and find out what Russell's surname is. Also go and have a look at The Trues. It's interesting. You might want to go and have a look at some clips from YouTube, The Tube as well, on YouTube. And see what that was all about.